Hello, this is Gina Piscatelli with a lecture on cranial nerves for Anatomy and Physiology 1. This particular diagram is of the inferior of the brain, and it's showing you the various nerves that come off of the brain, mainly the brain stem. There's a couple that come off of the forebrain, going to the nose and the eye. We're going to study all pairs of cranial nerves. They are paired left and right in this lecture. Since we haven't talked about nerves at all yet, I thought I better introduce the concept of nerves. Nerves are groups of neurons that are traveling to or from the same destination. We have 12 pairs of nerves called cranial nerves that arise from the brain, and most of them innervate structures that are in the head and the neck. We also have 31 pairs of spinal nerves. These arise from the spinal cord and will innervate the rest of the body and part of the neck in some cases. So, cranial nerves conduct impulses between the brain and structures in the head and the neck. For example, muscles that are located in the face, the jaw. Right here, there's a masseter muscle, and glands. Cranial nerves innervate glands so that they'll secrete whatever substance they're supposed to. The one that I circled is the parotid gland. That's involved with salivation. And also cranial nerves innervate our sense organs, like our eyes, our ears, taste, tongue then, and of course our nasal epithelium for smelling. There's one exception. One of the cranial nerves, cranial nerve number 10, actually travels inferiorly into the thoracic and abdominal cavities to control the visceral organs in those locations. So as I mentioned, there are 7 pairs of cranial nerves. The first one, we use Roman numerals when we talk about cranial nerves. So cranial nerve Roman numeral 1 would be the same as saying the olfactory nerve. Cranial nerve Roman numeral 2 would be the same as saying optic nerve. So you'll need to know the numbers and the names for all 12 of these. The first 2 I've mentioned. The third one, cranial nerve number 3, is the oculomotor nerve. Cranial nerve number 4 is the trochlear nerve. Cranial nerve number 5 is the trigeminal nerve. Number 6 is the abducens nerve. Number 7 is the facial nerve. Number 8 is the vestibulocochlear nerve. Number 9 is the glossopharyngeal nerve. Number 10 is the vagus nerve. That's the one that wanders down into the thoracic and abdominal cavity. Number 9 is the spinal accessory nerve. And number 12 is the hypoglossal nerve. Now those that you see in purple are the ones that we'll actually examine in lab at some point. So in the brain lab, when we do the sheep brain dissection and the human brain models, we see the olfactory nerve and the optic nerve. Those you're responsible for identifying. We also talk about the eye in the next lab, and when we move our eyes, there are muscles controlled by nerves. So the eye muscles are controlled by the oculomotor nerve, the trochlear nerve, and the abducens nerve. So when we do the eye, we'll talk about those 3. And of course today I will too. And then the vestibulocochlear nerve is for hearing and balance. So when we do the ear, we'll see that nerve. So this is kind of a diagrammatic representation of the important functions of all the cranial nerves. I hope that you find it useful um, as a summary. So each nerve is labeled. So olfactory, cranial nerve 1, all the way to hypoglossal, although not just on one side, just to be able to have room. Remember, they're all paired. So the olfactory nerve, there's two of them, one on this side and one on this side. And of course, I've only labeled one. And this slide shows you what if it's sensory, if it's a sensory nerve, or motor nerve, or maybe mixed because there's multiple neurons in nerves. One neuron could be a sensory neuron and one neuron could be a motor neuron, and they could be bundled together in a nerve. In addition, I put arrows, at least I tried to put arrows for the direction that information is traveling. So for example, for smell, the olfactory nerve, it's traveling to the brain. Okay, as opposed to if we look at cranial nerve number 3, which is really hard to see because it's so tiny. It's yellow, but it's so tiny. It sends motor information to muscles of the eye. Okay. So this is meant to sort of just be a summary and give you kind of a pictorial representation. This is a little bit easier to see. So most cranial nerves arise from the brain near the pons and the medulla oblongata. So here's the pons. This is the medulla. And you can see this is the third cranial nerve, oculomotor. And all the other nerves are posterior to that, I guess. So all of these, including the oculomotor, arise somewhere around the brainstem, as opposed to the olfactory nerve, which is more frontal, and the optic nerve, which goes to the eyes. And we identified the optic chiasm in the brain lab as well. Now, in order to reach the brain, these nerves have to travel through the skull. So cranial nerves pass from the brain through foramina, or from the facial structures or head structures through foramina into the skull and to the brain. So I don't know which way the information is going. It depends on which one we're talking about. But to get in and out, get towards the brain or away from the brain, a cranial nerve is going to have to pass through the skull. And that's why we studied all those foramina. For example, we studied the cribriform plate of the ethmoid bone that had all those little holes. That's where the olfactory nerve leaves the skull to innervate your nasal epithelium. And we learned the optic foramen, part of the sphenoid bone. It's at the back of the orbit. That foramen has the optic nerve in it, so cranial nerve number 2 going to the eyeball. The information, of course, is going from the eye to the brain. And then there are 4 cranial nerves that use the superior orbital fissure that I made you learn. So the slit that was at the back of the orbit carries the oculomotor, the trigeminal, the abducens, and the trochlear nerves. So a lot of nerves run through there. And there's the jugular foramen and the foramen magnum that carries the glossopharyngeal, the vagus, and the spinal. You don't have to memorize all those. These are just the ones in red, black, red, and green that you should be sort of familiar with since we studied the skull. So, oops, too far. Most cranial nerves carry the fibers between the brainstem and the part of the head that's on the same side. So ipsilateral, either sensory receptors like the eye, or muscles, effectors, on the same side. So most of the time cranial nerves are associated with the structures they innervate on the same side. However, there's an exception, and that is the optic nerve. The optic nerves cross, so they go to the opposite, some fibers go to the opposite side of the brain. So if I go back and I show you this picture, this optic nerve is coming from the right eye. And so visual information is coming into the brain. Some of that information is going to go to this side of the brain, but some of it's going to go to the other side of the brain. So that's the one exception. In other cases, information stays on the same side of the head. So, cranial nerves are classified as to whether they are completely sensory nerves with all sensory neurons, or completely motor neurons, so motor nerves, or if they're mixed. Maybe they have some motor neurons and some sensory neurons. So I listed the ones that are all sensory and the ones that are all motor and the ones that are mixed, but we're going to go through them. One thing that's very interesting is that the sensory function of a particular mixed cranial nerve might not be related to its motor function at all. Here's an example. The facial nerves, cranial nerve 7, conducts taste from the tongue, so that's sensory, but not motor to the tongue. Not motor to the tongue. Instead, the facial nerves carry motor fibers to the muscles in your face that you use for facial expression. So not really related that way. I mean, it's all in the head, but not directly related. I wanted to take an opportunity to review types of neurons with you because it's been a while since I've been able to touch base with you, being in an online format, and I wanted to just look at the structures of sensory neurons and motor neurons with you and try to describe this picture to you. So the blue lines and the blue circles all represent motor. Okay, so that's all motor information. And the circle is supposed to be the cell body. So this is the cell body. It starts in the central nervous system. And then this is supposed to be the axon going out to the structure in the axon terminal. Now, in smooth muscle glands, these are not voluntarily controlled things, and we'll learn about this later, but there just happens to be 2 motor neurons in series to get to those structures. Then in addition, I've got some sensory neurons here, and these blobs are supposed to be dendrites in sensory organs, like for example in the tongue or in the skin, the skin of the face, or maybe even blood vessels, how dilated or constricted they are. So these are all sensory dendrites. Dendrite carries the information to the cell body, so the information is going towards the central nervous system. And this is the cell body. And now we have the axons and the axon terminals. So this is the general structure of sensory neurons. We consider them unipolar, because they just have one process coming off of the cell body. We actually consider motor neurons to be multipolar, but my drawing doesn't really show it very well. That is because the cell body has lots and lots of little dendrites coming off of it, and I just didn't draw them. Okay, so lots of processes coming off of the cell body. So cranial nerves are going to have various types of neurons, sometimes all motor neurons, sometimes all sensory neurons, sometimes mixed, okay? And furthermore, if we wanted to, we could describe whether or not the cranial nerve is carrying somatic motor or somatic sensory, like general body, or visceral motor and visceral sensory, and special. We could really get detailed. We aren't going to worry about that though. Okay, so your study guide, this is what we are going to worry about. Your study guide asks you to be able to state the 12 pairs of cranial nerves by name and number. And for each cranial nerve, you'll have to identify whether it is sensory, motor, or mixed, and the structures that it innervates, and I guess what those functions are of those structures. So it could be endless, but we're going to narrow it down. So don't panic. You have a worksheet to go with this, and we will go over the worksheet together in class. And of course, I'll post an answer key. So you already know 2 of the cranial nerves, and that's from the brain study or brain lab that we did. Cranial nerve number 1, what is its name? It's the olfactory nerve. And what's its function? Smell. Pretty easy. Cranial nerve number 2, what is its name? It's the optic nerve. And what's its function? Vision. So I wanted to show you some pictures of these nerves. This is the olfactory nerve, cranial nerve number 1, and you can see that the olfactory bulb that we identified at the base of the frontal lobe leads to the olfactory tract. Together they're both the olfactory nerve. And there are sensory dendrites coming from your nasal epithelium, penetrating the ethmoid bone through the cribriform plate to get to this bulb where the sensory neuron cell bodies are. And then the axons are what's going to travel to your brain. Okay, so the nasal epithelium, nasal mucosa, same thing. So it's all sensory, and it passes through the skull through the cribriform plate. Now, the optic nerve is also entirely sensory. It enters the skull through the optic foramen, and we haven't studied this yet. I'm just going to repeat it because I mentioned it before. Visual information from both eyes will cross over. Some of the visual information will cross over to the opposite side, and some will stay on the same side. So for example, this eye will send visual information to this side and to this side, whereas the other eye will carry information also to opposite sides of the brain. Okay, you can't answer this question yet. Vision from which field of view would be affected if we had damage to an optic nerve? That's something that we're going to do when we do the eye lab. Okay. Okay, now we're going to look at the cranial nerves that control eye movement. And there's 3 of them: the ocular motor nerve, the trochlear nerve, and the abducens nerves. Okay, all three of these are entirely motor, so that makes that part easy. So this picture shows us the muscles of the eye, the muscles that are responsible for the eye moving. They're called extrinsic muscles because they're on the outside of the eye. So first I'll name the muscles because we haven't had the eye yet. The four that kind of come off directly from the iris, so there's an arrow there, an arrow there, arrow there, and an arrow there. They're all kind of rectangular muscles, so they're called rectuses. Okay, they're all rectus muscles. And the one on the top is called the superior rectus. The one that's towards the nose is the medial rectus, no big surprise. And the one on the bottom is the inferior rectus, and the one on the right, or lateral, is the lateral rectus. Then there's these two muscles that are kind of on the eyeball at an angle and make it turn. Usually more than one muscle is activated at a time, but nonetheless, the superior oblique makes the eye go down and out, and it runs through this little notch called the trochlea, that little hook, and then it runs posteriorly to the back of the eyeball. And then the inferior oblique is right here. Okay, so it's kind of at a different angle. Now, we aren't studying the eye right now, but I thought it would be nice for you to know why we're talking about nerves. There's also another muscle related to the eye, but it's all about the eyelid, and it's called the levator palpebrae, okay, to elevate your eyelid right here. So we've got three cranial nerves. These three cranial nerves innervate these muscles, and it's kind of easy to keep track because most of them are innervated by the oculomotor nerve, cranial nerve number 3. Oculo meaning eye, motor meaning muscle. Okay, but there are two different nerves that innervate two other muscles. So the trochlear nerve is going to innervate the muscle that goes through this little hook, which is called the trochlea. And that muscle is the superior oblique. I remember this, a little trick is a sulfate group, that's supposed to be an O. A sulfate group is SO4. So superior oblique and cranial nerve 4. I can't get the 4 to work. There we go. And then the lateral rectus, which is on the side, it abducts the eye. It makes the eye go away from the midline. So they gave the nerve the name abducens because it abducts the eye. So I remember LR6SO4. LR6SO4, lateral rectus, cranial nerve 6, superior oblique number 4. Just a little clue. Or trick, I guess. So here's the oculomotor nerve, and it goes through the superior orbital fissure, which is why I made you learn that in the skeleton lab. And then the trochlear nerve, it also goes through the superior orbital fissure, and it's entirely motor. And I have a question here. Damage to the trochlear nerve would make it difficult for the eye to look in what direction? It couldn't look down and out. It could only look up and in. But that doesn't matter. We're doing the eye later. And then the abducens nerve also runs through that superior orbital fissure. Okay, so that's it for the eye, the nerves that innervate eye muscles. Now let's look at two major cranial nerves that innervate the face. They're both mixed nerves. So cranial nerve number 5 is called the trigeminal nerve, And cranial nerve number 7 is called the facial nerve. But they will both be related to the face or the head in some manner. So, the trigeminal nerve is the largest of all the cranial nerves. And as I've been having these silly things spin around, the superior orbital fissure is important for the trigeminal nerve as well. But what's most important about the trigeminal nerve is that it has 3 different divisions. One is the ophthalmic division, which kind of goes to the eye region, and the maxillary division that goes to the maxilla, and then a mandibular division that goes down to your lower jaw and your tongue. Okay? Now, it's mixed. So the question is, where is the motor function? Where is the sensory function? It is the major and most important sensory nerve of the face. So if anyone is touched near the ocular region, maxillary region, mandibular region, it's the trigeminal that will carry that sensation to the brain. Okay, so that's the most important part. The other thing that's interesting is that the mandibular division is mixed. Okay, so there's some motor there. And the motor part is to the muscles we use for chewing. So there's a masseter muscle and there's a temporalis muscle that we need for chewing, and it's this trigeminal nerve that controls those muscles. So, you know how we have a blink reflex when something touches your eyelash or near your eye, and then you automatically blink without even thinking about it? It's cranial nerve 5 that is involved with that part, that sensory component of that reflex. Okay, so that's an important thing to know. And also the tongue, sensory from the tongue is carried by cranial nerve 5, but not from the taste buds, just touch. Cranial nerve number 7 is going to carry taste. So let's look at, I know I skipped 6, but I did it because it was part of the eye muscles. So the facial nerve, cranial nerve number 7, actually has 5 divisions. A temporal division, a zygomatic, a buccal, and a mandibular, and a cervical. I'm not going to make you know those, but it gives you the idea, if you look at this picture on the left, of how much it branches. Okay. Now there's some clinical tests you can do to make sure that the facial nerve is intact or not infected with some kind of virus. You can ask the subject to close their eyes, smile, raise their eyebrows, etc. That's all about muscles of facial expression. So if they can do those things, then you know that motor component of the facial nerve is intact. In addition, the facial nerve controls our production of tears. So you could try to make someone tear up by placing, which is really mean, ammonia fumes near their eyes and see if they tear up. Okay, that isn't a very nice clinical test. But also, the anterior 2/3 of the tongue is innervated by the facial nerve, and the facial nerve will carry taste from that part of the tongue. So, placing sugar, salt, vinegar in the anterior part of the tongue also tests for that facial nerve function. So, important things about the facial nerve. The facial nerve innervates the muscles of facial expression. It also innervates the salivary glands and the tear glands called lacrimal glands. It also carries taste from the tongue. And you might have heard of a condition called Bell's palsy, where one side of the face is paralyzed. The facial muscles aren't working, so the face sags. And a person also doesn't have the ability to close their eye because the orbicularis oculi muscle is not functioning. So sometimes it's due to damage of the facial nerve, some kind of, laceration type thing, but it can also be due to a virus. Okay, we're on our 8th cranial nerve now. This is the vestibulocochlear nerve. It is entirely sensory, and it has fibers that go to these semicircular canals that are in our inner ear that are involved with our equilibrium. So I'm having trouble with my drawing tool, but those 3 loops, those are the semicircular canals. Here's one. Here's another. And there's one in the back. So that's the vestibulo part. The cochlea is where hearing is sensed, and that's this spiral structure. So that's the cochlear part of the nerve. So vestibulo refers to balance, cochlear refers to hearing. Okay, cranial nerve number 9 is mixed. So we'll have both motor and sensory. The motor part that's important to us is that it innervates the muscles in our throat, or the pharynx, which I'm going to circle down here. I guess that one too. Those muscles in that region, and those muscles are needed for swallowing. So the glossopharyngeal nerve helps us swallow. It also has a big sensory component, and that is just general touch from the posterior third of the tongue. So it's part of our gag reflex. When you get something in the back of your throat and you gag, it's been sensed by the glossopharyngeal nerve. It also carries taste from that part of the tongue, so that's a special sensory. And it carries some sensory information from our carotid arteries, pH and blood pressure in particular, but I don't really care that you know about that. I care about swallowing, the gag reflex, and taste. That's what matters. You could study these things forever. There's be more and more and more. Okay, so now we'll go to the vagus nerve. The vagus nerve is named from the word vagrant. A vagrant wanders around. And so the vagus nerve, cranial nerve number 10, wanders far outside of cranial territory. It starts up in the brainstem. It's even in the, the neck or the throat region. Here, the pharynx, which we've seen before, so that's no big surprise. But it goes down into the thorax and carries sensory information from the lungs, from the heart, from all the abdominal organs as well, and it can carry motor information to the digestive tract and the heart. So it's really important. It is the major autonomic nerve, meaning functions that we do not consciously control that are motor will be controlled by this nerve, and we'll talk about that when we do the autonomic nervous system. So it senses our blood pressure, sends that information up to the brain. It can slow our heart rate as well as detect our heart rate. It can detect the state of our digestive organs as well as stimulate the digestive organs to contract. And one thing that's interesting that you might think is funny is, I don't know, I think it's a little funny, is that you actually have taste buds in your pharynx, down pretty low, beyond your mouth, in a structure called the epiglottis, as well as the wall of the pharynx. And so you can taste, you know this, after you swallow, how there's an aftertaste. Well, it's cranial nerve number 10 that's carrying that taste to your brain. Okay, all the hard ones are over. Now we're going to do cranial nerve 11 and 12. So cranial nerve number 12 is called the spinal accessory nerve. And I think it's because it really functions like a spinal nerve. The only thing it does is innervate two muscles. So it's entirely motor. And these muscles are skeletal muscles, so voluntary control. The two muscles are the sternocleidomastoid and the trapezius. Now the trapezius muscle actually has some complex functions, but it's all about shoulder movement and extending the head backwards. The sternocleidomastoid helps you turn your head from side to side. So contraction of this right sternocleidomastoid muscle will actually turn the head to the left. And we'll study that with our muscle labs. Okay, the last cranial nerve is the hypoglossal nerve, cranial nerve number 12. And hypo means glossal means tongue. So this nerve is going to innervate structures under the tongue, comes up under the tongue to innervate the tongue, which itself is a muscle. Those are called intrinsic muscles. And then there are muscles attached to the tongue to make it move side to side and up and down. Those are called extrinsic muscles. So the hypoglossal nerve innervates both types. It's completely motor. It's needed for speech and food manipulation. And it's usually tested by asking a patient to stick out their tongue, protrude it. If the right hypoglossal nerve is damaged, then the tongue can't be protruded on the right side. So the tongue will kind of deviate towards that side. So that's kind of an interesting clinical test. Okay, that's all for the cranial nerves. Thank you very much.